John pushed open the door of the small diner and stepped inside. The morning sun streamed through the windows, catching the dust motes floating lazily in the air. He had been driving for over an hour, trying to get to this quiet spot on the outskirts of town. It was not fancy, not at all, but it was known for its breakfast and coffee. Today, though, it seemed different. The smell of frying bacon and coffee was there, but it felt heavy in the air, almost like the diner itself was too busy to notice the people inside. John moved slowly toward a corner booth near the window. He liked corners. They gave him a sense of control, a small bubble of space where he could watch everything without being watched too much himself. He set his small leather bag on the seat next to him and looked around. There were a few customers scattered across the diner, mostly men in work clothes and a young couple sharing a pastry. A young waitress with a bright apron moved behind the counter, talking to another server and laughing. She had not noticed him yet. He waited. He waited for 5 minutes, then 10. The waitress moved past him again, carrying a tray full of orders, still not seeing him. John waved politely, hoping to catch her attention. Nothing. He tried clearing his throat, a soft cough that might signal he was there. Still nothing. His patience, normally long because of years in the military, was beginning to feel thin. John glanced at his watch. 40 minutes had passed. 40 long, frustrating minutes in a small booth with nothing but the sound of plates clinking, coffee brewing, and muffled conversations around him. He had never been ignored like this before. He had served his country, waited in lineups for supplies, stood for hours in rain and heat, and he had never felt so dismissed as he did right now. The thought made him smirk, despite his irritation. Here he was, a veteran used to discipline and patience, sitting in a diner where common courtesy seemed to be missing. He leaned back in his seat and tried to tell himself it was okay. Maybe they were busy. Maybe someone would come in a moment. John looked around again. The diner was modest, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. A couple of older men sat at the counter, talking quietly about the local football game. A mother tried to calm her restless child in a booth near the door. There was nothing particularly wrong with the diner itself. The chairs were old but sturdy. The paint on the walls was slightly chipped, and the floors had the faint smell of old polish mixed with spilled coffee. It was the kind of place that had been there for decades, the kind of place people relied on, the kind of place that usually had a friendly face to greet anyone walking in. But today, that friendliness seemed to have vanished. John felt a little more frustrated with each passing minute. He shifted in his seat, trying not to let the irritation show. He had learned in the military that patience was not just a virtue but a necessity. Impulsiveness could lead to mistakes, and mistakes could be dangerous. Yet he couldn't deny the sting of being overlooked. As he sat there, John's mind wandered to memories from his service. He remembered long nights in distant deserts, waiting for relief convoys that were often delayed. He remembered standing in lineups for food or water, waiting with other soldiers, joking to keep spirits high because waiting was part of life in the military. And he remembered his former commander, Colonel Richards, who always emphasized discipline, attention to detail, and respect for everyone in the unit. A small smile crept onto John's face at the memory. Colonel Richards had a way of noticing things no one else did. Nothing escaped him, and he always made sure every soldier felt seen, even in the most challenging circumstances. John had respected him deeply. And right now, sitting in this diner, John wondered what Colonel Richards would say if he knew John was being ignored for 40 minutes in a place that prided itself on service. John sighed and checked the time again. He had a meeting to attend soon, something important, but he didn't want to leave without trying once more. He waved his hand slightly, a gesture almost lost in the busy din of the staff behind the counter. The waitress finally glanced his way, eyes briefly meeting his. For a moment it seemed she might come over, but then she was pulled back into a conversation with another employee, laughing and pointing at something on the register. John sank slightly in the booth, shaking his head. He thought about getting up and leaving. That would solve the problem, but it felt wrong to give up so easily. He had spent his life learning to persevere, to wait, to hold his ground when it mattered. This was different from a battlefield, of course, but the principle was the same. He would wait. He had waited for worse, for harder things. The minutes stretched on. John watched the steam rise from his untouched cup of coffee, the smell of eggs and bacon teasing his senses. He tried to distract himself, looking out the window at the street beyond. Cars passed slowly, people walked dogs, kids biked past schoolyards. Life continued outside the diner as if oblivious to his small struggle inside. A group of construction workers came in, shaking off their jackets and laughing. The waitress hurried to take their orders, rushing past John again without a word. He leaned back, breathing slowly, trying to calm the frustration bubbling inside him. It was remarkable, he thought, how quickly a person could feel invisible even in a small place with a handful of people. As he sat quietly, John's thoughts returned to his years of service. He remembered moments of honor and duty, times when recognition was rare but deeply meaningful. He remembered the satisfaction of doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. That was who he was, and that was why he stayed, why he waited even when the diner ignored him. Finally, after 40 minutes, John let out a quiet sigh. He looked down at his coffee, now lukewarm, and felt a strange mix of resignation and determination. He would wait a little longer. Something told him that this day was not ordinary. Something told him that patience, as it always had in his life, would bring its own reward. He straightened in the booth, smoothed his jacket, and watched the door, unaware that the person about to walk through it would change everything. A figure stepped inside the diner, tall and commanding, moving with confidence. John did not yet know it, but this was no ordinary customer. This was someone who would make the next moments unforgettable. The bell above the diner door jingled, and John instinctively looked up. At first he thought it was another customer coming in to grab a quick breakfast. But the moment he saw the man step inside, his heart skipped. It was Colonel Richards, his former commander from the military. The same man who had taught him discipline, courage, and respect during the hardest days of his service. The colonel moved with calm authority, his posture straight, his eyes scanning the room with a sharp intelligence. There was no rush, no worry, just presence. John's first instinct was disbelief. He pinched himself subtly, unsure if he was seeing a memory rather than a living person, but the colonel was very much real, standing in the middle of the diner looking around as if he had a purpose. His presence immediately drew attention. The waitress who had ignored John just moments ago froze, her tray halfway to the counter. Other staff and customers turned their heads, recognizing the authority that seemed to radiate from the man. Colonel Richards walked slowly toward John's booth, his eyes briefly meeting John's. A small smile touched the corners of his mouth. "John?" he asked, his voice calm but commanding. The way he said the name made it clear he remembered every detail about the men who had served under him. "Is that you?" John stood quickly, unsure whether to salute out of habit or just shake hands. "Colonel Richards?" "Sir," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. His mind raced, remembering every rule, every lesson from years ago. This was the man who had guided him through long nights in the desert, who had kept him focused when the world seemed to collapse around them. The colonel's smile widened slightly. "It's good to see you, John. Mind if I join you?" He gestured to the empty seat across the booth. John motioned for him to sit, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. He had not expected to see his commander here, not in a small diner, not at this exact moment, and certainly not when he had been ignored for so long. As the colonel sat down, John's mind raced with questions. Why was he here? What had brought him to this little diner? And why did it feel like the day was about to change completely? The waitress finally came over, snapping John back to reality. "What can I get for you two?" she asked, a hint of nervousness in her voice. She kept glancing at the colonel, unsure how to act. Normally she was busy, distracted, maybe even careless, but now she seemed intimidated. John decided to remain quiet for the moment, letting the colonel speak first. "I'll have a coffee black," the colonel said calmly, looking at the waitress as if she were the most important person in the room. "And whatever breakfast you recommend." His voice was firm but polite, the kind that naturally commanded respect without demanding it. The waitress nodded quickly and hurried to place the order. For the first time in the morning, John noticed the subtle change in the diner. Staff moved faster with careful attention. Other customers seemed to sense the shift as well, their conversations quieting down slightly. There was a weight to the room now, a sense that something important was happening. John finally spoke, his voice still tinged with disbelief. "Colonel, I wasn't expecting to see you here. It's been, what? 10 years? The colonel nodded, his expression thoughtful. 10 years, he confirmed. "And it's good to see you looking well, John. You've done good work since your service, I hear." There was no pride in his voice, no arrogance, just recognition, the kind of respect that comes from understanding the challenges someone has faced. John felt a warmth spread through him. It had been years since someone had acknowledged his efforts so sincerely. He smiled, trying to hide the emotion that threatened to appear in his eyes. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot." For a moment, silence fell between them, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the quiet that comes when two people understand each other without needing words. Then John gestured around the diner. I've been waiting for 40 minutes. Nobody noticed me. I thought maybe I had walked into the wrong place." The colonel's eyebrows lifted slightly. 40 minutes? He repeated. "That's not right." There was a faint hint of amusement in his voice, but it quickly turned to seriousness. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "In my time, we never leave anyone waiting without being seen. I suppose some lessons don't translate from military service to civilian life." John chuckled quietly. "Apparently not, sir. I've been sitting here wondering if patience ever ends outside the military." The colonel laughed softly, a sound that filled the booth with warmth. It was the kind of laugh that reminded John of long nights around campfires, of trust and friendship forged under difficult circumstances. The waitress returned with coffee and plates of eggs, toast, and bacon. She set them carefully in front of them, almost as if placing them before a VIP. John noticed how attentive she was now, almost embarrassed at how she had ignored him earlier. He shook his head slightly, deciding not to mention it. The moment felt too important to waste on irritation. They ate quietly for a few minutes, sharing small talk about the town, the weather, and mutual acquaintances. John found himself relaxing, enjoying the rare feeling of being seen and valued in a place that had almost made him invisible. The colonel asked about his work, his family, and life after service. John responded honestly, feeling a rare connection, like the days of service were alive again in the conversation. Then, just as John was beginning to feel comfortable, he noticed the colonel standing up. "John, I want to do something for you," he said, voice firm but gentle. "It's not often that I get a chance to correct an injustice, even a small one." John looked at him curiously, unsure what he meant. The colonel walked over to the diner counter, speaking to the owner with quiet authority. John could not hear every word, but he could see the owner's eyes widen, the nervous gestures, the shift in attention. It was clear that the colonel had stepped into a role of influence that no one in the diner could ignore. John watched in surprise as the colonel returned to the booth, a faint smile on his face. "Consider it taken care of," he said simply. "Sometimes waiting brings more than frustration. Sometimes it brings recognition." John stared at him, unsure how to respond. He wanted to speak, to thank him, to express the mix of emotions rising inside him, but words seemed inadequate. He nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. For 40 minutes he had been ignored. Now, with the colonel in the diner, the air had changed, the room had shifted, and he realized that patience and respect had their own reward. Outside, the morning continued, but inside the diner, the story had already changed. John felt a sense of quiet triumph, not just for himself, but for the lesson that life sometimes rewards those who wait, those who persevere, and those who hold their dignity even in the smallest moments. John watched as Colonel Richards walked back toward the counter, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone in the diner. The staff who had ignored him earlier now straightened, their movements careful and deliberate. John noticed the owner, a middle-aged man with a tired face, standing behind the register, shifting nervously from one foot to the other. Something in the colonel's calm, authoritative manner made it clear that this was no ordinary visit. "Excuse me," the colonel said firmly, yet politely. "I'd like to speak with you about this place." The owner looked up, eyes widening as he realized who he was addressing. He swallowed nervously, nodding quickly. "Of course, sir. Whatever you need." John leaned back in the booth, heart racing. He had never seen this side of his former commander before. On missions, Richards was always strict, demanding, and precise. But this was different. He was a man who could command respect without raising his voice. A man whose presence alone caused people to act with honesty and attention. John had always admired that about him. The colonel returned to the booth, a small, satisfied smile on his face. "John," he said, lowering his voice so only John could hear, "I'm going to make sure this situation is corrected. Waiting 40 minutes without service is unacceptable. Everyone deserves respect, especially those who show patience and dignity. John nodded, a mix of relief and awe flooding through him. Thank you, sir. I wasn't expecting anything, really. But this, his voice trailed off. Words felt insufficient to describe the mix of gratitude and disbelief he felt. The colonel chuckled softly. Sometimes, John, life has a way of showing us lessons when we least expect them. And sometimes we get the chance to make things right, not just for ourselves, but for others too. He leaned back slightly, scanning the diner again. This place has potential, but it needs direction, leadership, and accountability. People deserve better, and I intend to make that happen. Before John could ask what he meant, the colonel turned back to the owner. I'm buying this diner, he announced, his voice steady and unyielding. Effective immediately. You'll stay on if you like, but the rules here will change. Service will improve, attention to customers will improve, and no one will be ignored again. The owner's mouth opened and closed, words failing him. He looked at John, then back at the colonel, clearly trying to process what had just happened. The staff exchanged nervous glances, some smiling shyly, others simply frozen in shock. The regular customers muttered quietly among themselves, disbelief and awe mixing in their voices. John sat in stunned silence. He had waited 40 minutes, feeling invisible and frustrated, and now, in a matter of minutes, the entire diner had been transformed by the presence of one man. The colonel had not only recognized him, but had taken action that went far beyond what John could have imagined. Sir, John finally managed to say, I don't know what to say. This is incredible. I never expected. The colonel waved his hand gently. You don't need to say anything, John. Sometimes we do what's right because it's right. You've waited. You've shown patience and respect, and that matters, more than you know. The atmosphere in the diner shifted entirely. The staff moved with renewed purpose, attending to each customer with care and attention. Plates were set neatly, orders were taken promptly, and smiles returned to faces that had seemed tired and distracted before. John noticed the energy in the room change instantly, the kind of energy that comes when leadership and respect are present. As he sipped his now cooling coffee, John thought about the irony of the situation. He had come in frustrated, overlooked, and ready to leave. He had been ignored for 40 minutes, and yet, this moment had turned into one of the most memorable experiences of his life. It reminded him of his days in service where patience, discipline, and integrity were rewarded in ways that weren't always immediate, but were always meaningful. Colonel Richards leaned back in the booth, smiling at John. You see, John, waiting sometimes brings unexpected rewards. People often don't recognize the value of patience, but it's a strength. You demonstrated it today, and it hasn't gone unnoticed. John felt a warmth in his chest, a mixture of pride and gratitude. Thank you, sir, truly. He paused, looking around the diner, taking in the subtle changes. I think this place will be better because of you. The colonel nodded. It will be. And you, John, should remember this. Leadership is not just about giving orders. It's about noticing people, valuing their time, and taking action when it matters. That's what changes everything. John smiled, understanding more than he could express. He realized that life's small frustrations often carried lessons, and that those lessons sometimes came with remarkable outcomes. He had been invisible for 40 minutes, but now, because of patience and respect, he was part of a moment that would transform not just his experience, but the experience of everyone in the diner. As the colonel stood to leave, he patted John on the shoulder. Keep living with the same patience and respect you showed today. Life will reward you in ways you can't imagine. With that, he nodded to the staff, who now looked energized and attentive, and walked out of the diner, leaving behind a changed atmosphere and a story that would be remembered by everyone present. John stayed in the booth a little longer, finishing his breakfast. He watched the staff move efficiently, customers being served with care, and realized how a single act of leadership could ripple through an entire room, changing behavior, attitudes, and energy. He felt a renewed sense of hope, understanding that patience, respect, and integrity were not just words, but powerful forces in life. As he left the diner, John looked back one last time. The small place that had seemed so ordinary and even frustrating 40 minutes earlier now seemed full of promise and purpose. He smiled, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. Today he had learned a lesson that extended far beyond breakfast. Sometimes waiting, patience, and the right person arriving at the right time could turn frustration into opportunity and disappointment into an unforgettable experience. John stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, carrying with him the memory of his former commander, the transformation of the diner, and the reminder that life often rewards those who wait with dignity and faith. The day had started like any other, with annoyance and frustration, but it ended with recognition, respect, and an experience he would never forget.